Well, folks, thanks for coming today. My name is Rob Eyler, and I want to thank AFWD for sponsoring this. I hope you're doing well. What I'm going to do in the next little while here is I'm going to talk about the economic situation at the national, the state, and the local level for Nevada County. I'm going to try to walk you through how an economist would look at where we're going and where we've been. And then ultimately, we'll talk about the population changes in Nevada and things to look forward to in terms of the next couple of years, especially with some of the forecasted data that are out there look pretty good. But we do have some caveats. So we're going to try to do an economic, quick demographic and sort of a roundup of where you need to be thinking if you're an economic development or a workforce development professional over the next couple of years. Economists are watching closely the evolution of the Biden administration in the first 100 days and what they're going to try to put forward in Congress with respect to spending. So we expect there's going to be some package that looks like so-called fiscal stimulus 3. And we are hoping for, as most economists believe, that macroeconomic investment is better than just spending with the idea of just trying to help people recover, because at some point we have to get beyond the recovery and investing in new technologies, new infrastructure, and a lot of different things that create jobs. That's a critical factor going forward. We know the fiscal stimulus round 2 is starting to show up at home. It's helping bridge over the next couple of months in theory, but at some point we have got to get through the current situation in such a way that we're starting to see job creation. And I'll reflect on that in a bunch of different ways in the data we're about to look at. But the fiscal stimulus does help stabilize decision-making. It cannot be seen as a panacea for everything that's gone wrong or really the true launching point of recovery. We need jobs to come back and we need businesses to be investing to get that kind of momentum over the next few years. The vaccines are on the way. We're hearing a ramping up of their use. As long as we don't hear anything about their lack of efficacy, we should be good going into the middle of the year with respect to stay-at-home orders not coming back, the lifting of most of the social restrictions, and really businesses and people getting back to quote unquote their pre-COVID lives with some adjustment. However, if we don't have the efficacy we're expecting, or we have some general issue with not turning the caseloads around, then we're going to be in this sort of slow, plodding along recovery period for some time without really a lot of momentum building. And that's a critical problem if that shows up, because then businesses are going to become, in a sense, reticent to invest anymore in an uncertain economy. And unfortunately, that uncertainty has hit our lower wage workers harder than anybody. So we've seen an increase in social services demand, and we'll talk a little bit about that later, nonprofit demand, and really just not a lot of good labor market momentum for our lower wage, lower skilled workers. And that unfortunately has led to a dichotomous recovery period thus far, which is not that atypical of other recessions. It's just that there's very specific industries that have been hurt. And we're now going to talk about some of those when we look a little bit deeper at the labor market. One of the ways that economists think about the way labor markets evolve is to think about how do people become unemployed? Well, these data are for the US from 2007 forward on a monthly basis, and these are temporary layoffs. So those temporary layoffs surged in March and April of 2020, and then started to slide as we entered the summer, because we did see states make adjustments. We saw people slowly get back to work, and those folks that temporarily lost their jobs started getting it back. However, some folks also became permanently unemployed who were originally temporarily unemployed, and that's these data. Now, why these data are important is because if you notice, the Great Recession, because this period is from January 2007 forward, is that big blue hill about a quarter of the way moving left to right. This is the normal way that recessions work. We see permanent job loss, not temporary job loss. So this recession was atypical about how it hurt the unemployed, or let's say augmented the number of people who were unemployed. And you can see the blue portion of the unemployed is starting to get larger, relatively speaking to the large size of the gray. But our concern is that we're seeing those folks convert from temporarily to permanently unemployed versus getting their job back or exiting the labor force, which is another option. So we're watching that closely. The other ways people don't have a job anymore or are not employed but maybe actively seeking work is they completed a temporary job and now they're looking for another one. They leave their job or they quit. They re-enter the labor force, which is an interesting dynamic that we've seen in this recession, where people may have elected to not go back to work or potentially leave the labor force on purpose because of childcare issues and now are coming back in. And then finally, new entrants, which includes high school and college graduates. So that rainbow look on the far right-hand side is important because the larger that gets, the longer our recovery period is. The larger the gray area is, the shorter that recovery period can be to get us back to where we wanted to be. But now that it's more of a mix, we're expecting a longer recovery period. And those data will show up in just a second when I show you a couple of other angles on the national labor market. Here are jobs and the changes from one year to the next by month, starting in April 2020. So for the national level, these are major industry groups. And here is the original damage that took place when the COVID-19 recession began really in earnest in April 2020. So historians will look back and say, okay, we know that the damage began in March, but the true damage showed up in April. You can see food services and drinking places and accommodation, basically leisure and hospitality industries, bars, restaurants, hotels, places where people gather. Other services is the third one from the right. Hair salons, nail salons, a lot of nonprofits that aren't involved in healthcare, generally speaking, businesses in which you're close to your client. Big downturn there. But labor market momentum, we talked about it already, kicked in. Here you go. There's November. So that entire time period between April and November, we saw slowly, steadily rising jobs growth, which is good. We heard about a quote unquote V-shaped recovery. We'll see that in just a second. And here's December. So unfortunately in December, we got a little bit of give back. These data are seasonally adjusted. So these are true data in that sense, in that if you look at these data, what they're really saying is that the negative 32.1% is suggesting that versus December 2019, 32 out of 100 people who have a job in December 2019 in a hotel do not have one as of December 2020. For bars and restaurants, about 1 in 5. So a lot of the damage in terms of the total unemployed really are in those two industries, and really in the 4 or 5 moving right to left. But those are big industries. You can imagine for the travel side of our economy, for the local side of our economy, and even in regional, just people coming to visit their relatives may stay in a hotel. That suggests that we just stopped traveling and it hurt a lot of industries at once. Another way to look at recovery is to try to say, well, let's compare another recession to the current one and see how they evolved side by side. What these data are going to show you, they're going to show you the Great Recession locked at 100 in November 2007, and the current recession starting in January 2020 also locked at the number 100, basically like a starting place for both. The Great Recession looks like this in terms of the total amount of people employed in the United States. The beginning of the recession, we think now, of the Great Recession was in November 2007. You can see this sort of long bowl-shaped look to the recovery of jobs in the United States. It took about 76 months for us to go from the beginning of the downturn to where we actually just got back to the same volume of jobs that we started with in November 2007. Now, for the US economy, this is what the COVID-19 recovery has looked like. You can see that sharp downturn first few months after January 2020, then what looks like the beginning of a quote unquote V, but then there's a modification, unfortunately, to that V in the wrong direction. And as we start to see it curl away from that red dotted line, we want that black line to move to the red dotted line for true labor market recovery, just like we wanted the blue line to move back to that red dotted line when the Great Recession began to show its face with lost jobs. Economic momentum is inside of that black line moving toward the red line. That's what we need to see. Now, our financial markets, however, have seemed to just brush this aside, you might think, in terms of we just keep seeing the S&P 500, the NASDAQ, the Dow Jones Industrial Average all rising. I'm going to try to explain why that's happening here in the next couple seconds. But this is the data historically of the S&P 500, and economists generally look at the S&P because of its broad base and how it's weighted over the last 20 years on a monthly basis. Here's the last 3 recessions, including the one that we still are currently in. It hasn't been declared over yet, but I'll allude to the idea that it's very close to being stated as being over, technically, not for everybody. You can see the dot-com recession at the beginning, slow downturn, then recovery. The Great Recession in the middle, sharp downturn, relatively decent recovery, but then a long bull market where we just saw climbing prices over time with a lot of wackiness after the Trump administration came in, because the business side of the house was seeing a lot of different potential angles on how it was going to get after-tax income, and then that happened. But we saw a lot of economic volatility there, at least for the first couple of years. Then really we saw a sharp decline at the beginning of this year, especially in March and April. But then we recovered. Low interest rates and the use of technology shoved a lot of money toward our tech industry, and our tech industry pulls a lot of these indices behind it. So why has the S&P 500 grown so well? Because those 6 or 7 major firms on the technology side of our lives that drive this index have grown, alongside of lower interest rates driving people to buying equities versus bonds. Hence the demand, hence higher prices. That's the basic explanation. Could have done the whole day just on that, but the idea here is the financial side of the house has held up pretty well. The other side of looking at finance is on debt. So have households increased their debt loads with the idea that they needed to use more credit to get by? Well, so far so good, they have not, but this is one place to watch, and I'll come back to this at the end. Here's household debt in terms of about a mortgage. So you can see here that the original movement up, these data are quarterly from 2003 forward to the third quarter of 2020. You can see the hill climbed for the Great Recession, the long downturn as people were adjusting to losing their home or having to refinance their lives in such a way to ultimately reduce the amount of debt they had. Then the slow climb back up over the last few years. But these data are inflation adjusted, so we are still below the peak of the last debt cycle with respect to how households are building up debt if you take inflation into account, which is smart to do. We take inflation into account in every other investment we make. We should do that here too. But this is just household mortgages. So the beauty of this is this is one of the best investments you can make, and the bulk of how households hold debt is in the homes that they own. Here's home equity lines of credit, which we haven't seen rise either. You can see the higher volume during the time of the beginning of the Great Recession. That has become a smaller proportion of the core household mortgage. Then we have auto loans, credit cards, student lending, and other vehicles. Shouldn't say it that way, I'm sorry. Other ways of borrowing that make up the total that households borrow. The point is that we're still not above the peak. We haven't seen it grown rapidly. We expected credit card debt to grow very rapidly. It has not happened yet, but it's in these data that we probably will see people become a little bit more loose in how they spend because they may have to. So what the fiscal stimulus has done is it's held off this side of the house having a lot of panic movements, meaning that instead of leaving my apartment, I'm going to take a cash withdrawal out on my credit card, bite the bullet in the hopes that my job will come back, but I got to stay in my apartment. Or I got to put food on the table and I normally pay in cash. Now I have to pay with credit. Those kind of items you're trying to stave off through augmented unemployment benefits and or fiscal stimulus payments directly to households. We will see if we get jobs recovery in the next couple of months and quarters that allow us to turn the corner without having to do additional stimulus in a large manner. But the forecasts are suggesting, and certainly politically, that we're going to need one more round of stimulus, because if we don't, we might see the debt part of the debt that households are holding rise dramatically, and we're trying to avoid that because those are one of the reasons why we saw the Great Recession get so deep. Well, more good news is that the IMF just came out with its international outlook for the next 2 years just this morning, and they said the United States is going to grow 5.1% in terms of the after inflation income it generates for everybody this year, about 2.5% next year. But before you get too excited about those numbers, we are starting from a smaller place in terms of what happened in 2020. You can see that negative 3.4 there in that shaded area. So the outlook is decent, not spectacular, but the key is really getting those people back to work who are currently still out of work. And that momentum has a lot of positive aspects on our local economy, our state economy, and reduces the pressure on our public sector and our nonprofit sector. We really need to have that happen. And it's like every other recession. That's why I start with that graph with the rainbow colors on the right-hand side, showing all the different ways people are unemployed. We need to make sure that we don't have a large surge in the people that are permanently unemployed, because it's harder for those folks to get back to work. Well, using those data as context, now let's look at California and Nevada County. The data look okay for Nevada County, not great. Like most every other county in California, we saw the unemployment rate rise in December for Nevada County. And we also saw it rise for the state overall, and for places like Sacramento that have actually been relatively strong in terms of recovery momentum. That momentum has also slowed down. Most of that because of social restrictions coming back in December, but also because consumer confidence kind of faded as we waited longer and longer to see that second round of fiscal stimulus, and spending started to wane, which made employers a little bit more reticent to hire. However, One number to watch is the labor force. You can see for Nevada County, there's almost 5% of the people who were in the labor force December 2019 who are not in December 2020. And that could be for a bunch of different reasons. It could be that people retired, thus they left the labor force. They're not looking for work or working. They may have left the area, or they may just simply have become discouraged and walked away from looking for a job. That latter bucket is the least likely to happen, especially if you need income. The more likely scenario is that people have left or retired in terms of that group. But generally speaking, as you can see across all these areas, recession brings with it a contraction of the number of people who are in the labor force. Some of it's because of discouragement, but also because at local level, there's a lot of moving around. So we're watching those data closely to see how long they linger. But generally speaking, this is much better than where we were 6 months ago. To show that comparison and kind of give you the same sense of what's going on locally and at state level versus the national, let's look at the same graph with respect to comparisons with the Great Recession. Same deal, starting in November 2007 and moving forward. Here is the jobs in California going toward the recovery period. Same kind of bold look. I kept the seasonality in this. I didn't deseasonalize these data because I think it's good to see that California has some seasonality in it and really didn't take away from the picture. But that's also because what's happened in the last 12 months, which is right here, it's very hard to take the seasonality out of it and make any sense of it because there's been so much violence in the data. Same deal though. Looks like basically a modified V. The last few months have been pretty tough. We need that black line to move toward the red line over the next 6 or 8 months if we want to truly have recovery be sustained and looking forward the next couple of years. Same story on the industrial side. Here's California in April. Far right-hand side, leisure and hospitality, bars, restaurants, hotels, big cut, almost 50% of those jobs that were there April 2019, not there April 2020. Other services, big cut there too, somewhere just under 30%. But now we're going to watch and see recovery momentum, and we're going to see it across all these industries, where some of these industries ended up becoming so-called essential industries, and that helps speed their recovery versus other ones. Here's May, June, July, August, September, October, November. So all the way to November, notice all those columns are getting smaller, smaller, and smaller. Just like the last graph, we want these columns to get back up to the red line and ultimately over that red line, looking back against 2019 to feel like there's actually been true industrial level recovery of these kind of jobs. Excuse me. However, in December, as you should expect, given what I showed you already, this is what happened. We saw some give back. If you look at those data on the right-hand side, just to remind you, for leisure and hospitality, bars, restaurants, and hotels, and places where people gather, negative 29.8% means that about 3 out of 10 workers who had a job December 2019 don't have a job in that industry December 2020. Now, that could be because there's been capacity loss and we don't have as many people or many businesses hiring, but that's a problem long term, especially if those businesses are in fact out of business. We don't think there's that many businesses that have completely walked away from being in business, but the longer this cycle lingers around and we just don't have full recovery, it's going to put more pressure on businesses to stay in business. And we'll talk more about that in just a sec also. Okay, here's a forecast of California looking forward toward the end of 2024. So we saw the IMF forecast, pretty good. We saw these other data that looked like we had recovery momentum going into this year. Well, the Department of Finance comes out with a forecast that is part of the governor's budget. And this is what employment looks like. Thinking about 2007 is equal to 100. So thinking about the growth since the Great Recession, how this recession unfolded, and ultimately the recovery path over the next few years. Here's the Great Recession. The space between that and the 110.5, which I'm going to highlight in just a minute, is the growth and recovery from the Great Recession. So we've seen an expansion of the total number of people employed in California, and then this recession hit. And notice where the bottom of the V is in that second shaded area is below the level of people that were working at the bottom of the Great Recession. So one of the things that this did is it really contracted the number of people working in California to the point where it basically blasted us back to volumes of workers that we had not seen since basically before the year 2000. Then we had a nice sharp recovery over the last couple of quarters, and the Department of Finance is seeing a nice smooth pattern up toward recovery, but that smooth pattern does not have a very steep slope. So that relatively flat slope means we're not going to fully recover until maybe 2024. So that, if you think about the picture I just showed you in terms of recovery, it could be 5 years, where the Great Recession took about 6 years to fully recover the jobs that were lost. So similar in that sense. And that's why we're comparing this to the Great Recession, not because we got in for the same reasons, but because the labor market is starting to show similar recovery momentum in terms of the total package. Okay, let's look at the same data for Nevada County. Now, Nevada County has got a little bit more seasonality in it than the California economy. It's got a little bit more farming on average, got a little bit more tourism on average. But here is the evolution from November 2007 to recovery, which took about 131 months for Nevada County. So just around 11 years to get back to where the number of jobs that were there in November 2007 were there again for Nevada County. Like most of rural California struggled on the other side of the housing recession to really get back on its feet and think about how to diversify with respect to its job market. But here is the COVID-19 recession, very similar picture, and not as much of a downturn right now in terms of the last month or so. It actually kicked up just a hair, which is good. And we saw that in those other data, right? We didn't see as quick a downturn as we saw in California with respect to the increase in unemployment rates. But for Nevada County, we still need to get that black line moving toward the red, and we need to keep that momentum going. A much deeper cut initially also. We look at Nevada County from an industrial level. Here's what it looks like going forward. Now, the data here are a little wild in the sense that the farming, as you're going to see in a minute, has shown a lot of positive momentum, which is great. How much of that is technically cannabis versus classic farming with respect to vineyards and or other crops and livestock is the data don't tell us those details yet. They'll tell us over the next few months. But you're going to see some wild recovery in farming and some other industries that have really gotten hammered. Also, because of that, the scale here is a little weird. For April 2020, if you look to the far right-hand side, you'll see the same basic pattern of job loss. But look at the percentage changes. For other services, over 60% loss of jobs year on year as of April 2020. But here comes the recovery. There's May, June, July, August, September, October, November. So you can now see the farm side building up very rapidly. You see across the board, basically every industry is showing recovery except for information, which is kind of an anomaly in rural places in California, or let's even say small suburban places of California. But even leisure and hospitality and other services showed really strong recovery momentum. Well, just like we expected, December was a little bit of a good impact. There's November, whoop, there's December there. Just a slowdown, which not big deal, but a slowdown. So notice that this is different than the picture we saw for California. In California, we saw leisure and hospitality and other services actually get cut, where in Nevada County, it just was a slower move up. So Nevada County is actually doing a really good job in its labor market, and hopefully it's a function of the fact that economic development has gone out there and really made it happen with businesses and workers that needed to make a transition. Now let's talk about housing. Here's the housing market. December 2020, looking back in time, 1 year and 2 years, you can see Nevada County 15.1% growth of housing prices at the median level. Now, if you couple that, and here it is, and there's some comparisons here geographically, if you couple that with the jobs data we saw, it could be that what you're getting is you're getting people who are coming to Nevada County with portable jobs, making those, sort of settling in, and that's changing the jobs data because of where people live with respect to some of those employment data. But the data I just showed you is for people that work for an employer in Nevada County. So the housing data, which you think would more affect residents, has been very strong. And how much of that, we hear a lot of anecdotal evidence, but how much of that is actually expatriates from the urban areas of California looking for a better quality of life. Those data are still evolving, but this is very strong data if you're a homeowner. And notice most of the growth over the last 2 years has just been in the last 12 months. But this also pushes other, lower income groups, those that are renting right now, further away, perhaps, from owning a home in Nevada County, which may turn into a discussion about housing equity. And the reason why that's important is because the Biden administration has that on their radar screen too, in terms of how new taxes might happen at the federal level or the push toward the state level to help fight some of housing inequities that have been building up over the last 10 years with respect to housing prices rising, wages not rising fast enough, and people losing a chance to actually own a home because of that split. Here's the housing forecast. So now if you look at this and you say, wow, okay, this is the percentage change over the next year or so. Zillow, where these data come from, tends to be a little bit more robust in its forecast than other housing economists who historically are more conservative. But regardless, other housing economists are not much more than about a percentage point plus or minus on these data. So we're expecting a really good housing year in 2021. And you might say, well, how is that possible after what we just saw in 2020? All the conditions are still there, especially if we have economic recovery momentum on top of low interest rates, on top of still relatively high rental prices. We might see some wild mechanics in 2021 with respect to rental prices and what landlords are willing to do to keep people renting versus taking whatever house comes up or leaving the area because the rents are still too high versus their income and their outlook for their job. So watch for that, but the housing market has a really strong forecast for this year. Here's what was called a K-shaped recovery by the Biden administration during the presidential campaign, but it is something that economists have been watching basically since the beginning of May, because it seemed like that there was a structural split between folks that make relatively high wages, which in this case, because of national comparisons, is $60,000 or more, versus folks at low wages, which are $27,000 or less per year. These data all come from Harvard University in a partnership with the Gates Foundation to use as much data as they can possibly put their hands on that corroborate each other, to put data out there with respect to how are we recovering. So these data start in January 2020, all start the same day. And the evolution of high wage workers is the dark line. And you can see that while there was an initial gutting of that labor market, it did pick back up over summer and then smoothly grew almost to the point where there's no change from where we started January 2020 by the end of October. Lower wage workers maybe 28% lower than when we started 2020 by the end of October, which is a big split. So that difference is what is the genesis of what we're calling a K-shaped recovery. Higher wage workers doing better than lower wage workers. Okay, well, we do have these data for Nevada County. The tracktherecovery.org website has a lot of data for Nevada County also. This is one of those data points. You can see if you're a high wage worker, you actually went off this graph the way it's actually put together by them. But then you came back, either way, about 1.8% growth of workers in high wage areas. This might corroborate again, because this is looking at the residents of Nevada County, not those that work in Nevada County. This may suggest that there are people who are inbound to Nevada County from other places because they had the ability to take their job and move there. Lower wage workers in Nevada County, a little worse off than California on average, but grew from the original lows. Remember, we looked at those data before on leisure and hospitality, bars, restaurants, hotels, places where people gather, and other services, the concentration of low wage workers in our economy. And for Nevada County, the original cut was very deep. You can see that here and how low those low wage workers went in terms of loss of jobs initially. Why do we care? Well, this split means there's more pressure on local government in terms of rising social services demand, and we need to watch that. Our nonprofits are being pressured. Our multifamily apartment owners are being pressured, which can put pressure on businesses looking to rehire if people start leaving the area because they don't see their job coming back and they can't afford to stay in their rental and they need to move some other place that's less expensive. So that's why this split is important, just as a beginning place. If we can solve those 4 problems, that helps a lot. But this is just the beginning of the issues if this split becomes structural or remains over time. Small businesses also facing kind of a dichotomy following basically the labor data. We believe in California that businesses under 500 workers, and really for California, this means under 25, maybe about 37% closed from those that were open in January to the end of December. Now, there's a nuance here. We don't know if these are permanently closed or temporarily closed, but based on your social media presence, the number of transactions you're doing or not doing, it's telling the database and those that are watching these data how many places remain open that were open January 2020. Well, for leisure and hospitality businesses, it's worse in the sense it might be as many as half for California. And you can see this split is also something to watch, because what we don't want to see is we don't want to see these businesses permanently out of business. What we are suspecting as economists is that these are not permanent closures. A lot of this is just simply reactions to social restrictions. But if the current situation comes back, meaning we're lifting the stay-at-home order, but for most of California, we're still in the quote-unquote purple area, we need to watch, or purple tier, we need to watch how long this continues to linger, and if caseloads reverse themselves again, and we have to do another shutdown of some type, that's going to make businesses, or that's going to put a lot more pressure on businesses throughout California, and really, if the United States sees this, throughout the country, slowing recovery momentum. Same data for Nevada County, except it's at the total businesses. They don't show the split for leisure and hospitality. We can see how up and down it was based on the lifting of social restrictions, the gains of new businesses, businesses being able to get themselves open, potentially the receipt of PPP money, as the case may be, to get themselves over the short-term problems. But ultimately, over the year, it basically flattened out about 31.6%, according to this database with respect to how many businesses were not open. We don't know if it's permanent or temporary, but this is not good in terms of the capacity of the local economy to build up jobs and really to generate incomes for local workers. Why is that important? We don't want to lose our restaurants and our hotels if we can help it. And we know there's going to be some pressure on them if we don't see travel come back. We don't want prices to rise because we have fewer choices locally. And then we're on the road from Grass Valley, Nevada City, and we're driving all the way to Auburn or driving all the way down the hill towards Sacramento because those shops just aren't there anymore. Those merchants have left. It also suggests that the cost of operations are rising in such a way that it's going to put more and more pressure on these businesses. So one of the reasons why we may see closures be relatively large as a percentage of those that were open pre-COVID is because the cost of staying in business right now is just too much and I have to wait, or I might not open again. And that's what's so nasty about these data, is because we want to know, but we don't have a great way of tracking them. In fact, economists really stubbed their toe a long time ago, not trying to put things in place to get data coming to them about businesses that are open on a regular basis. Almost every time a recession happens, I get asked, well, what's going on with business? And all I have to say is, I don't know for sure. We think that they're basically open and waiting, but we know there's going to be some that are going to close. Okay, let's wrap up now looking at population change in Nevada County. These data just came out a couple of weeks ago, and they show the components of how the population locally has changed. And it's important to see this because it has some implications about migration patterns and ultimately the way people choose to live certain places. So Nevada County, good quality of life, you would expect to draw. Here's births versus deaths. So one of the things about rural California is we've seen an older population move there. That means we have fewer families, we have more people who are more senior in age, and thus we're seeing basically populations flattening or dropping a little bit because more people pass on than are born. Another implication of that is those people that are relatively older are part of the labor force. They're not replaced fast enough by new babies because those babies are not part of the labor force for decades. So this is something to watch going forward, but how we make up the difference is through migration patterns. So this is the net inbound of people from other countries. And in fact, throughout this 20-year period, each one of these fiscal years showed positive inbound to Nevada County from other countries. But this is from other parts of the United States, and it's a little bit more of a mixed bag. But overall, including the last fiscal year, which ended on June 30, 2020, there hasn't been a whole lot of positive or negative change. It's been relatively stable on average in Nevada County over the last few years, and that's kept the population growth relatively flat, as you can see through that black line going the last 4 or 5 years. You'd think with fire threats, rising cost of living, you would see that fade a little bit, but Nevada County is still attracting population. It is likely to be attracting people that are coming with portable jobs. So the future for Nevada County looks really good, especially compared to other parts of rural California. What to watch overall? One of the ways in which we get back to square is to use credit markets. So interest rates look like they're going to remain low. We need to have that really grease the wheels of growth. And before, the interest rates are not going to rise unless we see actual economic growth that's sustained. So we should be planning on relatively low interest rates to come. Home prices are going to feed off of that. And then the next question is going to be, do we see the sort of dispersion around California from our urban area? And is it bringing jobs to places that otherwise would never have been attracted through economic development that are now suddenly here? Is it going to attract 250 people who used to work south of Market in San Francisco, who are now living in Nevada County and using, basically splitting their time at home with a good quality of life, or better quality of life than the city was providing. It's something to watch going forward if you're seeing that movement out of the urban area and it's permanent. There's a lot of hypotheses out there that it's not. There are some that are. That split, please bear in mind, the Biden administration has this as a focal issue. If that split becomes permanent and lower wage workers struggle to get their jobs back, this is especially true in the urban parts of California, we are going to see taxes rise in the United States at some point. They're going to want to really press on providing that funding, and there's going to be a wild movement in Congress. But one of the things about the Georgia elections that might show up for everybody else now is having the Democrats driving fiscal policy with the majority. If they see this as something that needs to be done, watch for that in the next couple of years with respect to tax rates. The public sector is also on the hook for a lot of what's going on with respect to that split and having lower wage workers suffering more and potentially in the long term. Cities and counties are on the front end of that. So we want to see funding also come not just to the states, but actually down to the cities and counties where a lot of the rubber meets the road with respect to social services, and try to help people and also try to help these governments turn the corner. The one beauty of this recession versus the last one is property taxes have remained relatively stable, which has been good, but we need those other parts of the economy to pick back up. And what we don't want to see is we don't, again, want to see an increase in debt. I talked about this earlier. One big question I consistently get is what is happening with how much money we're spending in Congress, and how is that going to affect our overall debt load and the stability of the American economy 10 years from now? And the answer is nobody can tell you that easily. But as long as the world is still buying American debt, it helps in the short term. It's at low interest rates, which also helps. But at some point, we've got to pay that back. There's no doubt about it. We can refinance it, and we've been doing this for decades, but it will put a little bit more risk into the global economy, which can then end up in our households through higher inflation, higher interest rates that are sustained. Right now, the outlook doesn't have that inside of it, but managing debt specifically at the household level is a big thing to make sure our communities turn the corner in a way that is sustainable. So folks, with that, I'm going to take any questions that you put in the chat. I didn't see any, though. I think I saw some hands raised. Let me see. Donna, I see your hand is raised. If you want to ask a question, let me see if I can get you to tell me what your question is. If you cannot speak, you should be able to. I'm asking you now to unmute. Donna, if you're there. If not, you're more than welcome to type into the chat any questions you have. I don't see any in the chat just yet, but I'm going to give it a minute and see if I hear from somebody. But otherwise, folks, if we don't quite get to a question, or we get off the call and you suddenly say, oh, I should have asked him this, that's my information, eyler@econforensics.com, @Bobby707 or 7007 in terms of my Twitter handle. Check me out and let me know what's going on. I want to thank AFWD again for having me today, and thank you all for coming. You will get a copy of the slides. Thank you for asking that question, Donna. This is also being recorded, so there will be a recording to go alongside of the slides. Okay, folks, well, thank you so much for taking the time today, and make it a great year out there. And Nevada County looks good, so take that into consideration as you're thinking about economic and workforce development planning. Take care.